Smoke was still in the air when I pulled onto Cedar Hollow Lane. A strange kind of quiet had settled over my street, like the pause after a punch lands. Charred iron twisted into grotesque shapes littered my front lawn, pieces of the past, pieces of my life. I hadn't even turned off the engine when I saw her. Marjorie Clark stood there, holding a glass of lemonade like she was admiring a trimmed hedge. Behind her, my great-grandfather's wrought iron fence, a piece of Civil War craftsmanship that had stood for over a century, was nothing but debris. She smiled. Doesn't it look better already? That's when something inside me cracked. Not snapped, cracked. The kind of crack that lets light in, or lets fire out. She didn't just bulldoze a fence, she bulldozed a legacy. And by the time I stepped out of that car, I knew this wouldn't end with an apology. Marjorie Clark had a thing for uniformity. She wore beige like it was a badge of honor, walked her Pomeranian at exactly 6:15 every morning, and measured lawn height with the precision of a military drill sergeant. She wasn't elected president of our HOA. She declared it. To some, she was harmless. A little too controlling, maybe, but mostly harmless. I used to think so too. The first time she came to my door, she brought a binder the size of a law textbook. Inside were pages of suggested paint palettes, lawn decor policies, and something she called the Visual Cohesion Doctrine. It wasn't in any official HOA paperwork, of course, but Marjorie didn't let technicalities stop her. She flipped to a page with swatches of approved fence colors: taupe, sand, ecru. This one, she tapped with a long pearl-colored nail, would really soften the look of your property. That black iron, it's severe. I smiled politely, thanked her for the suggestion, and shut the door. That was my first mistake. The second came 2 days later when I got a letter citing me for non-conforming perimeter design. Then came the fines, $50 a day. I sent copies of my historical preservation documents. No response. I contacted the HOA board. Silence. Meanwhile, Marjorie smiled at me every time I drove by, like we were in on some private joke. Except I wasn't laughing. You have to understand, that fence wasn't just decorative. My great-grandfather had it forged in 1889 by a local blacksmith. It curved like smoke, each post topped with a hand-hammered crest. People came from other counties to take photos of it. One historian called it an iron hymn in a world gone concrete. But none of that mattered to Marjorie Clark. What mattered to her was that it didn't match. It didn't conform. And worst of all, it drew attention. Marjorie believed attention was dangerous. It led to questions. Questions led to individuality. Individuality led to chaos. So she tried to erase it. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving a flurry of violation notices. My mailbox was too vintage. My doormat too informal. Tourists loitering. One letter accused me of fostering civic distraction. It would have been funny if it weren't so targeted. My neighbors started whispering. One of them, a retired librarian named Joan, confessed she'd been fined for having wind chimes. They interfere with the neighborhood's sonic identity, the letter had read. I started documenting everything. Photos, letters, dates. I had a folder labeled Marjorie's Crusade. Then came the day I found a sticky note on my front gate. Meeting to discuss urgent HOA compliance. Attendance expected. No time, no date, just that. I didn't go. That was probably mistake number 3, because 2 days later, I'd be standing in my driveway, staring at a pile of metal and dust, trying to remember if my great-grandfather ever imagined a future where his work would be reduced to rubble. In the name of neighborhood unity. And Marjorie, she'd still be smiling. The weekend I left for a preservationist conference in Richmond, I remember locking the gate with that satisfying metallic click, the same sound I heard as a kid when my father taught me how to oil the hinges. The house was quiet, the lights on timers, the fence still standing with silent dignity. I didn't know it would be the last time. While I was gone, Marjorie struck. She called an emergency HOA meeting. No one informed me. Not a call, not a slip of paper, not even one of her self-important sticky notes. It was held in her sunroom, lemonade provided, agenda already printed. Attendees included 3 of her close friends and 2 exhausted board members who'd long stopped pushing back. She presented the motion: immediate removal of non-compliant fencing on Lot 14. According to the minutes, yes, I eventually got my hands on them, there was unanimous consent. One neighbor claimed she passed out cookies during the vote. The next morning, she hired a demolition crew. Told them I had given verbal approval, said it was urgent, said she had muffins. They brought a bulldozer. I came home Sunday evening, tired but content, a binder full of architectural notes on my passenger seat. As I turned the corner onto my street, something felt wrong. My tires rolled over gravel that shouldn't have been there. The air smelled like scorched paint and hot metal. Then I saw it. The gate was gone. The columns pulverized, ornamental crests twisted into charcoal silhouettes. There was no elegance left, only the brutal geometry of destruction. And in the middle of it, in a crisp linen blouse and designer sandals, stood Marjorie. Clipboard in one hand, lemonade in the other. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. "Look so much more open now," she said, like she'd trimmed my hedges. I walked past her, didn't speak, bent down and picked up what was once the center crest, a 6-petal rosette, hand-forged by a man who'd survived Gettysburg. I had polished it with my father. It was the first thing he let me touch with a cloth and oil, saying, "This isn't just iron, kid, it's memory." I stood there, the rosette in my hand, my throat a furnace. "Do you know what you've done?" I asked. Marjorie shrugged. "I've improved the neighborhood." "You're welcome." That was when I realized she wasn't careless. She was calculated. This wasn't miscommunication. It was conquest. I took pictures, every angle, called the demolition crew, got names, took photos of their truck, their permits, their confused expressions when I told them the fence was federally protected. One of them showed me the work order. It was signed, not with a signature, but with a post-it note. Urgent, owner verbally approved, MC. That was enough. I called my lawyer. When I said the word bulldozed, there was a long pause on the line. Then, "Eli, that's a felony." He wasn't being dramatic. Destroying a federally registered landmark is a violation of both state and federal code. Minimum fines, possible jail time, and that's just the legal side. That night, I filed a police report, delivered physical evidence. The next morning, a federal investigator stood on Marjorie's porch. Clipboard against clipboard. Authority versus audacity. For the first time since I'd moved in, Marjorie had nothing to say, but her silence didn't last. She doubled down, sent me 3 more violation notices. One was for unauthorized seasonal decor, a full wreath. Another claimed my mailbox font was hostile. The last accused me of weaponizing historical status to intimidate the board. I didn't respond, I documented. Then I started talking to neighbors. Quietly at first. Casual chats turned into coffee invites. Complaints spilled out like old wounds. Unfair fines, stolen decor, unapproved fees, whispered threats. What I thought was personal, I learned was systemic. Marjorie hadn't just torn down my fence. She'd built a reign out of fear and passive-aggressive memos. And the moment that fence hit the ground, something else cracked. The silence of Granite Hollow. And I wasn't the only one who heard it. Something shifted after the wreckage, not just in me, but in the entire neighborhood. For years, we'd all played by Marjorie's rules, not because they made sense, but because questioning them felt like stepping into quicksand. You never knew what you'd get cited for next. A wind chime, a flag, a flower pot that dared to bloom too bright. But now, the spell was broken. I started collecting stories. Quiet ones at first. Michael, 2 doors down, was fined for growing tomatoes outside the edible produce zone. Joan had her bird bath confiscated for violating water feature policy. A young couple across the street, first-time homeowners, had been ordered to repaint their shutters because the shade of blue was psychologically disruptive. The list kept growing. I compiled letters, photographs, HOA memos, and board meeting notes. Every recommendation Marjorie had ever issued suddenly looked more like an ultimatum. I filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Authority and handed my folder, now thicker than the HOA handbook, to the same federal investigator who'd stood on her porch. Then came the audit. Turns out Marjorie's HOA presidency had been more than just oppressive. It was lucrative. Over $70,000 in fines had been collected in 3 years. Most of it was categorized under community enhancement. But the receipts told a different story. Catered luncheons at her home, a private landscaper hired monthly, even a $2,000 outdoor spa installed in what she labeled HOA Relaxation Garden, a plot of land no resident had ever seen. The demolition company submitted an affidavit. They had been misled. The work order was unofficial. The signature, a post-it note again. That was the smoking gun. Board members started jumping ship. One resigned mid-meeting and publicly apologized. Another claimed he'd never actually read the documents, just signed what Marjorie gave him. A third quietly moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Meanwhile, Marjorie clung to her clipboard like it was a lifeline. She posted online, calling the investigation a witch hunt, claiming I had corrupted the board and weaponized nostalgia. But no one listened anymore. When the Department of the Interior issued a formal statement classifying the destruction of the fence as a federal felony, she tried to claim the documents had been accidentally shredded. The DOJ wasn't amused. A week later, agents came knocking with more than just questions. She didn't go quietly, she never would. But she went. And just like that, the notices stopped. The fear dissolved. Porch lights glowed a little longer, neighbors began waving again, hosting porch dinners, swapping tools over the fence lines that had once divided us. They offered me the HOA presidency. I refused twice, then accepted on one condition. Everything would be transparent. No more hidden meetings, no more secret votes. We published our books, capped board terms, installed suggestion boxes. Then we rebuilt. A local blacksmith, an old friend of my father's, volunteered to recreate the fence. We held fundraisers. Kids painted signs. Donations came in from strangers who'd read about us online. When the final rosette was welded in, I ran my fingers across its edge, like I did when I was 12. It was smooth, strong. At the dedication, we unveiled a plaque. This fence stood for over a century. It stood through weather, war, and whim. And when it was brought down, it rose again. Not alone, but together. Marjorie's house went quiet. Her lawn grew wild. A for sale sign leaned crooked in her front yard. Weeks later, a typed letter with no return address landed in our community box. It ranted about unauthorized garden gnomes and morally unstable mailbox font. We framed it in the town hall bathroom, and then we threw a block party. There were bounce houses, a bluegrass band. Someone brought a cake shaped like the new fence. As I stood there, drink in hand, neighbors laughing around me, I realized something. She didn't just bulldoze a fence. She tried to bulldoze a community, and we built something better in its place. People say it was just a fence. But if you've ever lost something that held the fingerprints of your family, that carried the weight of stories older than you, then you know it's never just anything. It was a line between control and freedom, between silence and speaking up, And maybe we needed it to fall to realize how far we'd let things slip. Maybe it had to be destroyed for us to finally rebuild, together, stronger and louder than any clipboard could ever silence. If you've ever felt powerless against someone who makes the rules up as they go, know this. You're not alone. The moment you speak up, the silence breaks. And sometimes that's all it takes. If this story struck a chord, drop your own HOA horror stories below. Let's make sure these fences, real or metaphorical, stay standing where they matter most.